Good morning, everyone. And after the stream last night about the dadification or games with dads in them, I thought we'd take a look at some games who have that same content or theme or members of the family in relation to that idea that the player is playing either a father or a child's character in some sort of revenge plot or adventure about the motivations of family. This is a common element in life, and as such, it's a common element in stories. So it's not a gamification thing or something like that. This is natural. Telling a story about human relationships is a given. So I don't think this is a particularly unique thing in video games. It happens all the times in stories. But I want to do it through the guise of Metacritic because obviously The Last of Us Part 2 has been review bombed, and for good reason. You don't just get thousands and thousands of people to say, hey, let's go review bomb something without good reason. You can't just do that organically online. There's a good reason for that to happen. So people think that this is, we're up almost close to 40,000 ratings on the user score. It's gone up from 3.3 to 3.6. I don't know exactly how that works. I'm not an expert when it comes to Metacritic. I don't use Metacritic. But let's just compare other games with the same content. Okay? So before we jump to Metacritic, let's go to Amazon. I know people have been saying that Amazon had, or whatever you pre-ordered, had the highest pre-orders ever of any game. You're like, great, okay. So here's PS4, here's the special edition, the collector's edition. They're all getting low scores. There's not too many of them, but they all say the same thing. They're not going, oh, this game sucks, it's bad. They have detailed reviews. That's what Amazon is good for, getting people who have verified purchases and saying it's crap. So we have all these reviews happening right now. 1 star, 3 star, etc. Again, we're not going to talk about the content because we already did that before. We're going to look at other games similar. So it's getting hit not just on Metacritic, it's getting hit wherever it's sold as well. So here's the first one that jumped to mind was God of War. Here we have almost 13,000 reviews. 9.1. This is a story about Kratos and his son on a journey to bury his wife at a certain point in the environment. And you learn about the family relationship they all have, what their lifestyle was like, why the gods were involved. It's usually gods are involved in Kratos having to kill them. So it's still an ultra-violent game with a very beautifully done story between a father and his son. So this was the clearest one I could think of. Also super popular. So you get very excellently done games, and people want to review bomb them for good because they love it so much. So the scores are very similar. This was actually reviewed more by critics, so it was even more liked by critics, or more popular than The Last of Us Part 2. Half-Life 2. Now, you might not think this is very relevant. I don't think it's too relevant, but this is also a very popular game. I wouldn't say this is review bomb just over years, because this has been like almost, 16 years? So over 10,000 reviews, all very popular. We're talking about the relationship between Alex Vance and her dad. Few cutscenes here and there. What happens to her father, not very pretty, but it's certainly an element of the story, which is not necessarily the most emotional. We're talking about a game which focuses on gameplay. People played the game for its very unique take on first-person shooters. I think the gravity gun was a very big selling point. The design of that, entire levels were designed on that. Some of the plot was designed around that as well. So, very popular game, having daddy elements, if you will, and still being dramatic, still telling a story. In fact, it's probably one of the better ways of telling a story via gameplay, because the focus is gameplay, with cutscenes being sort of a secondary part of that. So let's jump over to JRPGs. This is a game I haven't finished, but I did play at the time for a few hours. I had friends play it, and family members, etc. Over 1,500 ratings, so not review bombed. But in the story, we have a father figure. I think his name is Jet, and he's very not abusive, but he's sort of a hard love character. And you actually have to get to the part of the game where you have to fight your father and defeat him. And he explains this is all to teach Titus, to toughen him up, to become a man. And I think they did that through a common theme of the story, which was blitzball. And he was always like, hey, you gotta get better. Can't even learn how to throw a ball, blah blah blah. So it's kind of a flashback series of cutscenes teaching Titus to get stronger, get better, which is a common theme in most video games. It's, you have to get stronger to progress. So having a narrative element to that is a great way of doing it. Not the most original, but it's pretty neat, and it's attractive. Lots of voice acting, etc. This was back in 2001. Wow, almost 20 years. So we have characters with relationships that aren't exactly the best, and they're learning how to grow. So very, very common, very basic themes in this story. Then we switch over to survival horror, Silent Hill, an even older game, not review bombed unless you want to compare 600 ratings to 17 ratings between user and critic. This is a story, I think his name is Mason, Harry Mason, something like that. And he's just looking for his daughter. The whole story is him looking for his daughter and the crazy, creepy adventure he goes on and what eventually happens to their daughter. So lots of dark themes, lots of mysterious themes of gore and horror. And that sort of started off the whole Silent Hill experience. So again, lots of fans, not recorded fans. I'm sure it's a cult classic. We're talking about before the internet became a huge thing, 1999. I think it started in 97. So internet was just getting started, but people enough after 20 years or 21 years were enough to talk about this game and go to Metacritic and score it. And very similar scores, 86 to 89. So not much discrepancy there. People can understand quality even back in the day. And now we're going on to the one that I think also popped in my head very early, which was Fallout 3. The whole plot is for you to find your dad. And this was the jump into 3D for the Fallout series. And we got the cutscenes where the whole world stops and you zoom in, eyes locked on the one person while they monologue to you and you ask questions and what have you in dialogue. So not the most popular of the 3D Fallout games, but you got, was it Liam Neeson playing the role of your dad, and the father's on a quest to bring water to the wasteland. And this is a post-apocalyptic world. It's brutal. There's lots of violence, lots of cutscenes with violence, especially with VATS. So not directly comparable to The Last of Us in content, but nonetheless getting a somewhat similar score. Obviously, it's very different because this is a highly customizable game, and not everyone likes that style of gameplay, and especially in relation to Fallout 2, but it definitely uplifted the genre and the series as a whole, I would say. I just like the fact that you had a real plot that was clear, voice acted, and in full 3D, which was really cool. Of course, the gameplay was excellent for crafting, which was always fun, but not the best response. Still, the storyline was there, just not as good as it could have been, I think. Let's compare this to Fallout 4, which you play as a dad, and you're there to find your son and what your son has become, and he essentially becomes a father figure as well. And not the greatest score. Why is that? Was it partially the gameplay? Maybe. There are some multiple endings, which is great about the Fallout series as a whole. So you have multiple ways of not only playing the game and all the factions they're in, but how they end as a result of your choices. That's kind of the focus of the game. And nonetheless, it still got a lower score. This is on PS4. So what makes this game unpopular? We can go into details I'm not going to jump into that, but it has to do with gameplay not being as good as the previous Fallout. Issues of quality have always popped up with Bethesda, especially after Fallout 76. So there's multiple reasons why this gets a mixed score. And it's not because of the story. There are few elements of the story which could have been better for sure. That's always arguable. But it's mostly about gameplay and why it doesn't compare to the role-playing elements and choices you can make from the previous Fallout game. And the previous Fallout game, which is also my favorite, is New Vegas, highly customizable, all sorts of gameplay options, all sorts of endings, all sorts of ways to deal with challenges. So we're talking about a very specific kind of game by a specific kind of company, by Obsidian, who actually designed RPGs and knows what they're doing to make that kind of experience for players. Not review bombed again, slightly less than Fallout 4, pretty much the same amount, actually less than Fallout 3. Less ratings, even though it's much more popular, I would say, to the hardcore RPG fan base. So focusing on story and gameplay, giving you many more options than Fallout 4 would be, this was the game to compare to. Very similar scores, not perfect, very buggy, as most Obsidian games tend to be. So, again, Fallout, post-apocalyptic world, similar settings, very specific plot. You're going after a chip, you're not going after a father figure, but just to compare the scores, that's why I was doing it. So, let's keep going. Red Dead Redemption, another one that popped up with the stream last night. Obviously a story of redemption and a story of revenge. So the revenge story is who he's going after, and redemption is relation to his family. I'm trying to remember the characters in Red Dead Redemption. Obviously, you play John Marsden, and you have a son figure, a wife figure, and it's pretty straightforward. So you can tell straightforward redemption and revenge stories that are very popular. I wouldn't say 3,000 is a review bomb, but it's a pretty popular game enough to get a score. And it's not as similar, not as close a score, but it's definitely up there in the positives. So here we have another strange game. This is David Cage. And whenever David Cage makes a game, it's kind of like, what did you do, David? This was not review bombed. I would not say less than 1,000 is a review bomb, but the scores are almost identical. And it's a story about mostly Ethan Mars. There's multiple characters or main characters in there. And he loses his first son, which is a whole tragic scenario where you're chasing him down in a mall and he ends up getting hit by a car. And then it has multiple endings about your next son, which is Sean, a very famous Sean joke about the bug. So in that story, you could have Ethan either survive or get arrested and imprisoned or even killed. And there's multiple endings as well. And that's a big question with Heavy Rain. What is the best ending? What is the worst ending? There's all these different permutations. So we can compare that to Detroit Become Human. David Cage likes to have these games which are multiple choice. They're essentially, that's what Detroit has become. It's just become a multiple choice style of game where you have all these branching narratives. So that's a clear-cut style of game. Same with Heavy Rain, which was more of a let's experiment with the interface sort of thing. So same with the PC version. I don't know how that translated well. This was definitely not review bombed. But the game was designed primarily, I think, for the PS4 and all the wacky interface elements with the controller. I think they were showing off was it for the PS3? Yeah. They were showing off all the input devices and methods of interacting, like how to open a door, how to walk, how to do anything, really. So I can see how that might have not been very popular on the PC because of the difference of interface. So lots of themes of parenting and fatherhood, trying to save a son, being traumatized by that. What does it mean to have a family? Very, very clear story, which wasn't as well reviewed, but it's a David Cage game. You expect a little bit of strangeness there, a little bit of wackiness, being the auteur game developer. Here we have Walking Dead, Telltale. This is very similar to the setting and themes of The Last of Us and Last of Us Part 2. I wouldn't say it's a review bomb, almost 3,000. Score is nearly identical. It's a story-driven game. It's almost purely cutscenes and purely QuickTime events. So much less production value, but the same idea. Fully voice acted. I think some of the stories there's Kenny, who's the father figure. There's also, you could say, the main character is also the father figure to Clementine. But Kenny also has to deal with loss of his family to the zombie infestation. Very almost destroying, heart destroying, not heartwarming story. So lots of tragedy, dark themes, and violence. Very, very similar. So, hey, this is doing pretty well. I wonder why. Now, this is one that popped up I just thought about was Assassin's Creed. Now, Assassin's Creed is a much more complex game, and the series is very big. I've only played the Assassin's Creed 2, as well as Assassin's Creed Brotherhood, and I do recall the death of the father figure from Ezio, and I think his brother as well. So I think the whole Ezio family, or the Auditore family, got killed. So it initially becomes a story of revenge, and then it develops into much more between the ongoing war between Templars and Assassins, who has the pieces of Adam, what they mean. So it develops into more than just a revenge story, but it really sets up the motivation for the character to do something with the whole plot. And this is only 16,000 or 1,600 ratings compared to 70. Very similar scores, and this is the common theme with games. These are all very similar scores we have. They're all very close with a father figure or family figure type scenario. Now, this is also another one I thought of as well. This is a big part of the story of BioShock Infinite. And BioShock Infinite is one of those greats, one of those games we look at as a great because it does so much. I would also put, Ken Levine and David Cage on the same level, just different ways of making a game. They're video game auteurs, as we like to say. This is almost 9,000 ratings. I would say it's a review bomb. Slightly lower than the high 90s, or I would say the 90 scores for critics. The whole plot twist is pretty much a daddy story, or has a daddy character. There's two big reveals about daddies. So, very, very violent game. We're talking uber violent, very detailed. Obviously not as detailed as The Last of Us Part 2 because of technology. This was made back in 2013. Came out the same date as The Last of Us. But very, very strong themes of violence, jingoism, religion, all sorts of great concepts. Obviously running off the original BioShock, which was fantastic. I didn't play number 2, but we're talking about high quality games, and this game was supposed to be so much more. It was promised to be so much more, just like The Last of Us, and we have either the downgrade or whatever you want to call that experience from E3 to store shelves. There was a big change in game design, and a lot of stuff was left out. So that's a very similar story to the AI in The Last of Us. So I would say this review bombed. Not too much difference, but we're talking about a great. We're talking about a big title that has a lot going for it. So you're going to get different reviews for sure. There's a lot to like. There's a lot to dislike. There's a lot to become accustomed to because they're redefining the first-person shooter the same way, let's say, a Half-Life 2 redefined the first-person shooter where the focus was mostly on gameplay. This was a mix between gameplay and storytelling, but still using the daddy theme, if you will. And that brings us back to The Last of Us. Also, 9,000, almost 10,000 ratings. Extremely similar score. Also about having a daddy. Probably the biggest game I could think of, which is a focus of being a father figure. And even the choice that's made at the ending of the story is about being a dad. An altruistic choice, a situational ethic where you decide to choose your selfishness, I guess, the life of one person over the potential life of others. And that's great. You can have these ethical quandaries in your stories. And overtly positive, almost 10,000 scores, very similar to the critic scores, with the same concepts of fatherly figures in a story. So you might think there's something wrong here because most of, if not all of these games are positive to average or mixed positive scores, all having to do with daddy figures or revenge plots or redemption plots of the son or the daughter. It's pretty close that people have very similar opinions but are still positive games. Whereas The Last of Us Part 2, not so good. Not so good in the storytelling department. Every score, not every score, but some of them they don't have very much to say, but almost every score is bashing the story because it doesn't tell a good story about the death of a loved one. You could have all the technology in the world. You could use the right genre like survival horror, post-apocalyptic, zombie infestation. But if you don't kill off characters properly, which is in 95% of every story you've ever read, has a death or has the theme of death or killing or murder, then you don't know what you're doing. You've screwed it up. And we can go through, I can go through detailed analysis of all these stories if I wanted to look at the father figures and how they're handled, how the death of father figures are handled, how the death of children are handled, and why it works, and why people didn't freak out as they did in the same way with The Last of Us Part 2. Anyway, guys, thanks for listening. Hope you enjoyed. Have yourself a great day.